You've probably heard the term periodization before, but it probably comes off as something that's very complex and very annoying to understand. But it's fine. I'm going to help you guys out and make it easy to understand. We actually need to understand what the word periodization kind of means. So periodization comes from the word period, kind of meaning a phase or a grouping of time. These periods or divisions of time are described as phases. What these training phases do is basically they target specific biomotor abilities or fitness abilities in order to improve them based on the concept of post-phase potentiation. Post-phase potentiation just means that when we train one specific quality, then it will actually have a delayed transformation or a delayed training effect on another training quality. For example, improving hypertrophy will improve strength. Periodization is a very effective training plan that works for a lot of people, but sometimes it's not really necessary for everybody. So kind of who it's not really necessary for, beginners, kind of those general population clients that, they're just there to kind of just get a little bit more fitter, burn off a little bit more fat. I would really more recommend periodization for more serious lifters, intermediate to advanced, or even really competitive athletes. Because periodization was mainly adopted from using it with competitive athletes. These competitive athletes always have some type of competition coming up, so you need to understand how to properly manipulate strength training in order to fit that competition, because athletes, the competition comes first, strength training is second. So as you can see here, I've developed I think it costed me about $2 million to make this, and it took me about 3 years to create this entire chart, so my life is pretty much on the line here, and if this video doesn't get 1 million views, I'm going to go crazy. But besides that, how periodization works, we need to kind of understand the more grand scheme of things, and then we'll trickle down the mountain and then kind of understand it on a smaller scale. So we need to kind of start from top up and go bottom down to kind of understand the whole grand scheme of things. So to really kind of emphasize it, let's start with just the annual training plan. Annual training plan is very, very simple. It's just your entire year of training mapped out into one plan. That's all it is. So the annual training plan really doesn't have any specific features of it. It's all made up of all this, everything I've written down here. You can also have a multi-year plan. Those are really more or less used for like Olympic athletes because their training is very long term because they're literally trying to peak for 4 years. So it can take a while, right? They need a very long-term plan. But kind of for us right now, annual plan is okay. The annual plan is made up usually of about 1 to 2 macro cycles. Now, macro cycle can sometimes be interchangeable term with annual training plan, but just for simplicity's sake, we're going to call macro cycle basically what makes up an annual training plan. So you have 2 macro cycles that make up this annual training plan. Macro cycles are essentially broken up into 2 phases, a preparation phase and a competition phase. Kind of if you would want to apply it to most American sports or North American sports, that would just basically be an off season and an on season. For example, if we had American football, anytime from January, February, depending when you get eliminated in the playoffs or if you win the Super Bowl, February to about August. And then the competition phase begins August to January, December, right? So kind of our macro cycles, just think of it as more of an off season and an on season. So these macro cycles are made up of about 2 to 3 mesocycles. A mesocycle essentially is just about 4 weeks of training, 4 to 6 weeks of training, and then you just give it a name called a mesocycle. So as we trickle down here from the preparation phase is divided up into 2 different phases, 2 smaller phases of preparation. General prep phase and a specific prep phase. And as we see in the competition macrocycle, this macrocycle is divided up into 2 phases, which are 2 different mesocycles. The pre-competitive phase and the competitive phase. So kind of the pre-competitive phase would just be something before competition, and then your competitive phase would be your peaking or your taper. During the general prep phase, what you're mainly going to be focusing on here is just kind of building up a work capacity and building up a base. Pyramid is only as tall as its base, so if you have no base to build from and you just try to automatically just try to get all these very specific qualities, you're going to have a hard time. In the general prep phase, what your main focus should be on, this is more applying to any like powerlifter, bodybuilder, or just anyone that wants to strength train and lift weights. The main focus should be aerobic capacity. So no matter what, you should be doing some form of cardio, but in this case that you'll be working on more aerobic capacity and doing a bit more cardio and doing more higher rep muscular endurance type training, as well as you should be focusing on a lot of technique work. So for example, a lot of technique work would be like, for example, doing zombie front squats or like doing overhead squats, something like that, to really reinforce technique where the intensity isn't super high, but you're going to have very high volume. You're going to have very high volume. And when I speak about intensity, I mean more or less the loading in terms of percentage of your 1 rep max. As well, if you use the RPE based system, it's going to be more lower RPE. So the general prep phase can really mostly be characterized by just that higher work volume, more variety in training, more general exercises. For example, if you're a powerlifter, you're not going to be training your 1 rep max squat under competition standards and trying to really load a shit ton of weight. What you'll be doing more is trying to integrate different movements in different planes. For example, using a transverse plane or a frontal plane movement versus constantly moving in a sagittal plane, and maybe doing more like sled pulls and more work that's not as specific to your sport. That's the idea, so you can build up a more variety of movements and bigger. As well, your volume is going to be a lot higher and intensity will be lower. So intensity kind of meaning relative to your percentage 1 rep max. Obviously, because you're doing muscular endurance training, you can't train, at 90% of your 1 rep max if you want to do 20 reps. Makes no sense. As well, though, even if you're using an RPE based system, you're going to be training at a lower RPE. Mainly because is that if you just try to go balls to the walls right in the beginning in your general prep phase, you're going to get burnt out. Specific prep phase, it's more or less just a continuation of the general prep phase, but now you're going to start honing in on a little bit more specific movements. For example, if you're a powerlifter, instead of doing sled pulls now, you're going to kind of go to something that's a little bit more specific to powerlifting. Not so specific, but maybe you'll do like a front squat, or maybe you'll do like a safety bar squat. Something like that that's going to really mimic that squatting pattern, but you're going to utilize kind of a bit of a different loading mechanism or different positioning. That way that you're still getting loading in the proper place for your body, but it's not going to become stale once you get to that competition phase at the end phase. So essentially the specific prep phase is going to be characterized by you can increase, and now from going from an aerobic capacity perspective, we try to increase anaerobic endurance. And then you're going to be probably focusing on, instead of general muscular endurance, hypertrophy. And then you're going to decrease your variety of movements, and then that percentage of intensity is going to increase. So obviously from going to muscular endurance, which you'll probably be working like 70 to 65% of your 1 rep max, now you start increasing to 75, 80% of your 1 rep max, getting into more of that hypertrophy phase. Once this specific prep phase is finished, we're going to shift into the competitive macro cycle here, and we're going to start getting into the pre-competitive phase. The pre-competitive phase is essentially you're going to really just be mimicking your sport a lot more. For example, if you're a powerlifter, now you're going to start doing your low bar back squats. Now you're going to start doing more competition style stuff, and you're going to be really refining those skills. And essentially, if you're going to go from a muscular endurance hypertrophy perspective in terms of increasing that, now you're going to go into a strength training perspective. As well, now you have more movement specific to your competition. Now you're going to have to really try to master those technical and tactical skills that you're going to use in your competition. So for example, kind of learning how to use your equipment if you're a powerlifter, learning how to bounce out of the bottom with your knee sleeves, learning how to brace into your belt, something like that. So we're not only getting into physical qualities now, but understanding tactical and psychological qualities that are going to make you a better athlete and make you perform a lot better on that competition date. As well, we're going to have a reduction in training volume. You want to have a reduction in training volume because as that intensity is climbing, right, you built up a really good base through here, right, and you had a lot of volume for here. You can't just have a lot of volume, low intensity, and then maintain the same volume and then increase intensity. It's not going to work out well for you. This is obviously more of a linear periodization approach, so we're not going to get into undulating and concurrent and conjugate periodization. This is purely a linear periodization approach. Now, once you've done this pre-competitive phase, you'll probably repeat it 2 times. You're going to go into that competitive phase. Now, the competitive phase essentially what it really is more defined by, it's basically going to be like your pre-competitive phase, but now you're going to see a big reduction in volume and a much bigger climb in intensity. And what you're going to see is more of a, you're going to have a taper essentially. What I like to do is I like to run a taper approach, which I'm not going to get too much into a taper, but essentially what a taper is that from here, you'll run your pre-competitive phase, you'll do a deload, and then you transition into your competitive phase. You'll run a taper for about 8 to 14 days, which means that you're just going to really increase training intensity and percentage of your 1 rep max, but you're going to drop volume by about 40 to 70%. Depending on the athlete, you need to play around with it. You need a little bit of practical experience to understand what taper reduction in volume works best for you, but you're going to taper into your competitive phase. Then once you taper, you're going to do a deload, right? So taper, deload for about a week to 10 days, and then you'll do your competition. So the competitive phase is mainly just characterized by a very high intensity, very low volume, and very, very specific training towards the competition and tactical training as well. So for example, I keep using powerlifting because it's just an easy example. Kind of a training session in the pre-competitive phase, normal training session. Now, for example, in the competitive phase, maybe you do a mock meet to kind of really mimic that training or mimic that competition. So that way that the tactical preparation, the game plan essentially, and the psychological preparation are all kind of rehearsed before. That way that when you go into your competition, you're going to have a lot of confidence because you've done it before. You've basically gone from very extremely general to as specific as possible. And building that base up with the muscular endurance and the hypertrophy is going to help you make sure that you can maximize those qualities of max strength and strength. From building this base of having kind of general endurance and that muscular endurance to hypertrophy to strength to max strength, it's going to allow you to have this concept of post-phase potentiation, which I mentioned earlier, is that all these different qualities will all eventually help you when you want to get to that competition. Right? Especially the muscular endurance and the hypertrophy from a strength athlete perspective, because if you build up a big base of muscular endurance, it's going to allow you to, get more sets in, get more volume with your hypertrophy, get stronger, and then that hypertrophy is then going to help you be able to have more muscle tissue and more cross-sectional area to then maximize your strength. And once you kind of work on, your strength there, you'll develop these neurological adaptations that's going to help you just be as strong as possible on your meet day. I'm kind of using powerlifting as an example here just because I've used it before. I will talk a little bit about microcycles here. Microcycles just represent 1 week of training essentially, right? That's pretty much what a microcycle is. So microcycles can be pretty much defined as ordinary or developmental microcycle, shock microcycle, or deload or active recovery microcycle. A taper isn't really a microcycle. I kind of just put it in there, but a taper is, it does help. It is a microcycle that you're going to be using. So just for simplicity's sake, we'll call a taper a type of microcycle. Essentially what you want to do is you want to run this pattern of like wave loading or step loading. They're kind of actually two interchangeable things, but we'll say wave loading, for example, where you go ordinary, shock microcycle, deload. Ordinary, shock, deload. Ordinary, shock, deload. And kind of what that means is that ordinary would just mean that you're going to kind of keep the same volume, keep the same intensity. Obviously the next week you want to kind of have a bit of a small increase in intensity or volume, right? And by intensity, I mean percentage of your 1 rep max or the total weight you're lifting. You want to just small increase it. So start small increase in weight. Then what you're going to do is you're going to shock the body, have a large increase in weight, something that's going to be, pretty hard. It's going to be a hard week. You're really pushing, right? And then after you have that shock microcycle, you need to take a deload, right? Because then when you have that deload, you're going to have delayed transformation, and then you're going to allow yourself to get stronger. To essentially just summarize about a 10 to 15 minute video, I have no idea how long it's going to take because I haven't edited it yet, but you're going to go from this concept of high volume, lots of variety in your training, lower intensity in terms of like RPE and percentage, muscular endurance, high reps, and then you're going to essentially just transition into the opposite. Higher intensity, lower volume, less reps, less variety, more specific to whatever your goals are, which is like a competition. And then that's essentially it. Like, periodization is not really that hard. A lot of like sports coaches and certified strength conditioning coaches, they need to make it like they need to gatekeep a little bit, but unless you're actually training like a top NHL, top MLB, NBA team, then you have to really account for, practices, games, tournaments, things like that. You have to account for that, and that's where this balancing act becomes a lot more complicated. But for the average Joe and for the average person, where they're not constantly competing in 82 games a season, then it's not as difficult to manage. So essentially, that's pretty much it. I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Make sure to go check out DanoffFitness.com for the best fitness merch you've ever seen in your life. If you don't buy it, I will probably kill myself. So yeah, I hope that's enough incentive for you guys to buy it. But thank you guys, and have a good rest of your day. And yeah, make sure to subscribe.